This is my video called The Best Pizza I've Ever Made, and it was documenting me making Roberto Susta's 100% Biga recipe. He only recently released this video and it's detailed beautifully. And if you don't speak Italian, you can set the closed captioning to auto-generate in English or whatever language. But before this video, I had no idea what diastatic malt powder is or was. And I had never envisioned myself using wheat germ oil in a pizza dough. In any case, I followed this video and I made a few modifications, and I'll explain everything in greater detail with this video because apparently the first one moved too fast. So first, the recipe. This is the recipe in Roberto Susta's video for 100% Biga. 80% hydration means 800 grams of water for 1 kilogram of flour. The yeast varies between 0.1 and 1%. For these purposes, I'll use 1% yeast, 2.2% salt, 2% wheat germ oil, 1% diastatic malt powder, and the technique for this is 100% Biga. So 100% of the flour, 45% of the volume of the flour and water, and then 50% of the yeast. So the yeast is split between closure and Biga. And then all of the remaining ingredients is on closure after the Biga has pre-fermented for 48 hours. So here are my modifications. First of all, I'm a mere mortal, so I'm comfortable with 70% hydration. Whenever I use active dry yeast and water, I add 5 grams of natural sugar source. So I use maple syrup. It could be honey. I find that helps. And I use Pizza to establish my yeast. Pizza. So I've programmed this to give me the amount of yeast on 1 kilogram of flour. So the room where I make the dough is at 21 degrees, and I leave it out for 3 hours, and then 45 hours in the fridge at 3 degrees, active dry yeast. For 1 kilogram of flour, it's 2 grams of yeast. So I use 2 grams of yeast. This will vary where you are, what room you make it in, the time of the year. The last difference is how I close the dough. And it came out of an Instagram live chat I had with Roberto because the prior Biga attempts I had were a bit too dry. And there's this technique called il bagnetto, or a little bath, where you split the water on the closure 60-40 into 2 containers. And with the 60%, you dissolve the remaining yeast and 5 grams of maple syrup. And in the 40, you dissolve all the salt. And you soak the Biga in the contents of the 60% in a bagnetto, or a bath, for 20 to 30 minutes prior to closing the dough in the mixer. This cuts down on the acids which have developed and makes the process smoother. So I add my teaspoon of maple syrup to 450 grams of water, or 45% of the volume of the flour. I mix in 1 gram of yeast, and I add it to a kilo of flour. And then this is the Biga no stress method that Roberto Susta invented. It's an easy way to make sure the water is absorbed and the gluten network is not created. We are not trying to form the glutens yet. This is just to set up a lactic fermentation process. When it's done, we add the flour that's not been absorbed to the bottom of the bowl first, and then the more formed bits go on top. You wrap it with plastic wrap, leave it on the counter for an hour at room temperature, and then into the fridge for 2 days. Measure out the ingredients and split the water 60-40 into 2 containers, one with 150 grams, which will contain 1 gram of yeast and 5 grams of maple syrup, and another container with 100 grams of water with the 22 grams of salt dissolved into it. 10 grams of diastatic malt powder and 20 grams of wheat germ oil are in 2 other containers. Then you take 60% of the water and dump that into the Biga and let it sit for 20 to 30 minutes. So after soaking, we add the mass of the Biga in its entirety, we don't break it up, into the mixer. Then you add the diastatic malt powder and start mixing. This mixing process is obviously sped up, but to let you know, it took 19 minutes, but you let the KitchenAid do the work. The key to understanding when things are mixed in is to be conscious of when the dough mass detaches itself cleanly from the stainless steel bowl. So as you mix in the water, you add it in bit by bit, and when you notice that the dough mass forms and pulls itself away from the stainless steel bowl, then you add the next little bit. And when you've mixed in the remainder of the water and salt from the second container, you can add in the oil. You'll know the oil is mixed in when the mass pulls itself cleanly away from the stainless steel bowl. After that, I mix the dough until it's around 25 degrees. You need to be conscious of when you add in the water that you're adding it in slowly, because it'll get ruined if you put in too much water all at once or before things are absorbed properly, so take your time. I also keep a spray bottle handy and periodically add sprays of water to bump up the hydration. After that, you let it rest for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, we turn on the mixer just until the dough cleanly detaches itself from the stainless steel bowl. Then we can transfer the dough to a work surface. You oil up your hands and you do a few reinforcing folds. You oil up the bowl and the dough and you put it back into the mixing bowl. Now be sure everything is lightly oiled with your hands. Then you cover it all up with the plastic wrap for 1 hour to bulk proof at room temperature. The dough will be ready to ball up after that. After your 1 hour bulk proof, it's time to ball up the dough. So you transfer the dough back to your work surface and begin weighing out 280 gram dough balls, and you form your dough balls. I use a bit of semolina flour here to assist in the process, and I find it easiest to make the dough balls upside down in this way. I use dough trays that fit in my fridge. So we leave the dough out at room temperature, covered, and when the dough balls double up in size, they're ready to be cooked or refrigerated until it's time to cook. And that amount of time varies depending on your room temperature, but it's between 2 and 3 hours. And this is what it looks like after a couple of hours. For me, I have to put this in the fridge. And this is how the dough cooks up. I think the reason I called this the best pizza I've ever made is because I've been trying to master pizza canotto since I learned about it, and Roberto Susta put out his instructional video which had the details in it that allowed you to get your teeth into the nitty-gritty, and this dough puffed up beyond my expectations. Like, my jaw still drops when I rewatch this video, largely because I can't believe I managed to do it. And the flour that I used was bread flour, simply because it has the highest protein content available to me, and it's like $5 for 2.5 kilos. So I used $2 worth of flour for 6 pizzas, which is 33 cents per pizza in flour cost. Look, this is all homemade, and it wasn't that hard to do. I encourage you to try it. Comment below if you have questions, and let me know if you give it a try.